President Biden said that there was reason to believe that the 300,000 strong Afghan National Army, which was, he said, as well equipped as any army in the world, could hold out for up to a year against the advancing Taliban forces. They didn't last a week. Just 2 days after the Pentagon said there was no imminent threat, this evening, Taliban fighters are sitting in the president's chair in Kabul. I mean, literally, with their weapons, sitting in the president's chair. The United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken said there will be no comparison between Kabul in 2021 and Saigon in 1975. But in fact, comparison there is, and it's not a flattering one. The United States scramble out of Kabul beats even the scramble out of Saigon in many important particulars, to which we shall turn over the course of this show. But I want to leave you in this monologue with some thoughts of some importance. First of all, compare and contrast the fighting performance of the 300,000 strong so-called Afghan, so-called national, so-called army with the Syrian Arab army, which for 10 years against a far superior, far better armed insurgency, backed by the world's most powerful countries, fought on and on and on and ultimately prevailed. A Sunni Arab army fighting to defend a secular Arab state headed by a heretic Shiite, according to the descriptions of the Takfiri terrorists, the Taliban of their day, that were invading, desecrating, massacring, torturing, and mutilating the people of Syria. Just think about that. 10 long years the Syrian Arab army fought. The Afghan National Army did not fight for 10 days after the final offensive was launched. Second takeaway is this: compare and contrast the attitude of Russia to its ally Syria with the attitude abandonment by the American patron of its ally in Afghanistan. And don't think that that comparison will have been missed by any of the satrapies that currently shelter under the umbrella of American imperial power. The Russians stood by their ally, the Americans abandoned theirs, and the so-called president of Afghanistan has already flown out of the country to neighboring Kyrgyzstan, though that is unlikely to be the final watering hole that he chooses for his long exile. He's likely to end up somewhere near you, as are tens, scores, maybe hundreds of thousands of refugees that are already on the march into Pakistan, into Iran, two countries which simply cannot hold or sustain them. These refugees will not stop marching in Iran or in Pakistan. They're marching towards you. Just one of the reasons why I opposed 20 years ago in Parliament and on the streets of London and other cities, rarely on the media, because even then our anti-war message was heavily censored and often lampooned. It's one of the reasons why I said that invading and occupying Afghanistan was a bad idea of historic proportions. Now, what do I think of the Taliban? Let me tell you what I said in Parliament almost exactly 20 years ago. In an award-winning speech, I described the Taliban and the excrescence of Al-Qaeda, which they had clasped to their bosom, that these people were medieval, obscurantist savages. And nothing that has happened in the last 20 years has made me resile from that description. It's not because I liked the Taliban, I loathed the Taliban. I was opposing the fathers of the Taliban when Britain and America were stuffing weaponry and money and propaganda support down their throats. These medieval obscurantist savages were our boys back in the 1980s. On the eve of the fall of Kabul, to the fathers of the Taliban, I told Mrs. Thatcher, you have opened the gates to the barbarians, and a long dark night will now descend upon the people of Afghanistan. And so it proved. I mention all this not to bask in the rapid 20-year vindication of everything that I said, but to try and persuade you, to persuade your politicians to listen to those who know. If I knew, a graduate of the University of the Streets from a council house in Dundee, that no good could come of our patronage of these savages, how could the Oxford Blues of the British Foreign Office and of the government front bench and of the opposition front bench, the House was virtually unanimous about that policy, but I and others, a few others, knew that it would lead to terror, tears, and blood. And so it did. And so when I argue for a fresh approach, now that the Taliban are in control, it's not because I like them, I still loathe them. But I want to avoid Afghanistan becoming again a launching pad for international terrorism, pan-Islamist terrorism, which imperils us all. And I have some ideas as to how that can be done. But permit me this observation. Our countries are led by fools. Jacob Rees-Mogg has recalled Parliament for next week. Next week. He must have listened to the Pentagon spokesman who said there was no imminent threat. What's he going to say and do in Parliament next week? Joe Biden, what did he think would happen when he symbolically, for that's all there was left by the end, symbolically withdrew 2,500 American soldiers? The Taliban were just waiting for the cue. It's not that 2,500 American soldiers could have stopped a Taliban advance, but they didn't want the complication of having to fight their way through every last dead American to come to power. As soon as Joe Biden began that withdrawal, the cue was there for the Taliban to advance. And another dark night will now descend upon the people of Afghanistan. There'll be no more lipstick in the restaurants of Kabul. In fact, there'll be no more women in the restaurants in Kabul. There'll be no more women in public life at all in Kabul, Kandahar, Mazar-e-Sharif, or any of the towns and cities in Afghanistan. Women, metaphorically speaking, are about to disappear. There'll be no women in universities. Matter of fact, There hasn't been many women in universities or in public life over this last 20 years. The only time women could freely live in Afghanistan was in the short period in which a government ruled that Britain and America and other Western countries destroyed. That was the only time you could really safely wear lipstick if you were a woman, open a book if you were a woman, dream of becoming a doctor or a scientist if you were a woman. That's why I feel so bitter about our role in the 1980s in Afghanistan. I now watch, particularly on American TV, but also here on social media, a long parade of feminists who had nothing to say about the woman whose head was blown off in front of her children by B-52s, by cruise missiles. They're even more savage than the obscurantists of the Taliban. They had nothing to say about the destruction of that golden era in Afghanistan that was portrayed as the anti-Soviet war, but was in fact a golden age, the only golden age that there has ever been in Afghanistan. Permit me this observation. If we pursue the policy we have been pursuing of ostracism, sanctions, destabilization, subversion, siege, and even war against the new Afghanistan, it will turn out just like the old Afghanistan. Now is the time to pursue a different course. Let everyone diplomatically recognize the new government in Kabul. Let every embassy open and function in Afghanistan. Let not the aid stop but flow. This time not military aid. $2 trillion has been blown in Afghanistan. Let's kill the people of Afghanistan with kindness. Let's cooperate with Afghanistan's neighbors instead of trying to use Afghanistan against her neighbors. Let's deal with and coordinate with the government of Pakistan, of Russia, of China, of Iran, who all border Afghanistan, so that an international package can be properly implemented in Afghanistan. Because I've got to pull up what happens next. Another 9/11? Another kind of Taliban? Or another war? The Afghans have been fighting wars against foreign occupiers for millennia. As I've often told you, even Alexander the Great did not successfully occupy Afghanistan. And Boris Johnson and Joe Biden sure ain't Alexander the Great. Enough of war. Enough of fostering Al-Qaeda and ISIS-type terrorism as long as it's aimed at somebody else. Let's try a new approach. Let's recognize the new government of Afghanistan. What choice have you got? They already are the government of Afghanistan. The question now is, what kind of Taliban-ruled Afghanistan is there going to be? Forget ideas about democracy and liberalism. That ain't going to happen. The only legitimate interest as a state, not as individuals, but as a state, that we have now with Afghanistan is to preclude it becoming again a base for international terrorism that harms other people beyond their borders. That means keeping ISIS out, keeping Al-Qaeda out, making the new power in Kabul realize that there is more to gain from international cooperation than there is from international opprobrium and condemnation. That's my thesis. I'll defend it against all comers in the course of the show this evening. I expect Afghanistan to dominate the show this evening, but it is not the only show in town. Prince Andrew, the son of Her Majesty the Queen, within, I think now, about 17 days, must enter a defense to a case brought by a woman who was illegally trafficked for sexual purposes from the United States to the United Kingdom by definitely Jeffrey Epstein and allegedly also Ghislaine Maxwell. The attitude of the royal family to date has been to complain about nothing and to explain nothing. That might work in the deferential media operation in Britain. It will not work in the court in New York. And if we are to avoid the surely supreme indignity of the son of the Queen being found guilty by default of a sex trafficking crime, with all the consequences that will flow from that, the royal family better get their ass in gear, and very, very quickly. And there's much else. I could talk about Britain's finest film director, Ken Loach, being booted out of Keir Starmer's Labour Party, but why bother? Anybody that's still in Keir Starmer's Labour is a fool or a knave. One by one by one by one, they're all being politically eliminated. And still you've got people hanging on in there for what they never, ever explain. I will be talking later about the latest monstrosity of the separatist government in Scotland, which has introduced new regulations which will compel teachers in Scotland, if confronted with a child as young as 4 years old, who tells them they'd rather be Arthur than Martha, to allow that child so to identify and to use the boys' toilets and the boys' changing rooms. And the unkindest cut of all, the school will be obliged to keep this metamorphosis secret from that child's father and mother. I've put up with a lot, but up with that I will not put. And I am ready to unite with all people of goodwill in Scotland, across Britain, because Scotland is still a part of Britain and decided decisively so to be, to kill this monster, this creep, monstrous creep of gender bending with Scotland's innocent children.